In the early 19th century, the world was a rhythmic hum of iron and steam where the clock was not a digital flicker, but a heavy mechanical heartbeat that dictated the lives of thousands. Imagine yourself standing on a cobblestone street in a growing American mill town, just as the first gray light of dawn begins to creep over the horizon. The air is cool and carries the faint scent of coal smoke and river mist, and the only sound is the steady rush of water over a nearby dam. For the workers of this era, there was no concept of Saturday morning lion or Sunday brunch because the sun up to sundown rule was the iron law of the land. You can see them now emerging from small wooden row houses with their shoulders hunched against the morning chill, moving in a silent procession toward the massive brick factories that loom like fortresses against the sky. Inside those walls, the day begins with the deafening roar of belts and pulleys, and for the next 14 hours the workers will become extensions of the machines they tend. There's a hypnotic quality to repetition, as shuttles fly back and forth, and gears grind in a never-ending cycle of production that leaves no room for the wandering mind. The windows are often nailed shut to keep the humidity high for the cotton threads, and the dust motes dance in the narrow shafts of sunlight that struggle to penetrate the gloom. You feel the weight of a 70-hour work week in the very marrow of your bones, are deep and heavy. Tiredness that makes the idea of leisure feel like a foreign language or a distant dream from another lifetime. As the sun moves slowly across the sky, the shadows in the factory lengthen and stretch, but the pace never slackens because every minute is measured in output and every hour is a test of endurance. When the final whistle finally blows long after the sun has dipped below the trees, the workers stumble back out into the twilight, their hands stained with oil and their ears still ringing with the mechanical ghosts of the machines. They walk home in a daze of exhaustion where a simple meal of porridge or bread awaits them before they fall into a dreamless sleep, only to be awakened by the same bell in a few short hours. There are no parks to visit, no books to read for pleasure, and no quiet afternoon spent watching the clouds, because the labor consumes the entirety of the human experience. The concept of a weekend does not exist even in the imagination of the boldest dreamer for. The week is a seamless loop of toil that resets only briefly for a few hours of mandatory church service on Sunday morning, where the sermons often remind them that hard work is a path to salvation. You can feel the heavy stillness of this life, where the days bleed into weeks and the weeks into years with nothing to mark the passage of time except the changing of the seasons and the gradual wearing down of the body. As you listen to the steady thrum of this historical machine, let your own breathing slow down to match the pace of the old river that powered those mills. Feel the weight of your limbs as if you had just finished a long day in the year 1820, and the darkness of the room is wrapping around you like a heavy wool blanket. The world outside is quiet now, the factories are silent, the gears have stopped turning, and the only thing left is the soft, repetitive sound of the wind in the chimney. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to accomplish, because the work of the past is over, and the rest you have earned is deep and vast like an ocean. Imagine the smell of old wood and candle wax as you drift further away from the noise of the modern world into a place where time moves like honey. The pressure of the day dissolves into the atmosphere, and the repetitive nature of the story acts as a lullaby, pulling you deeper into the velvet folds of sleep. Every comma is a breath, and every period is a moment of total stillness as we journey back to a time when the stars were the only lights in the night sky, and the world was vast and mysterious and very, very tired. Sleep now as the history of the weekend begins to fade into the background, and the only reality is the warmth of your bed and the rhythmic pulse of your own heart. The sun has set on the 19th century, and the long night has finally arrived to give you the peace that those early workers could only dream of reaching after a lifetime of sunup to sundown. Let the darkness be your sanctuary and the silence be your guide as you drift into a deep and restorative slumber where the hours no longer matter and the machines are forever still. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a curious and quiet rebellion brewing in the dimly lit taverns and small cobblestone alleys of the industrial world, where the air was thick with the scent of hops and the heavy dampness of the evening mist. Imagine the flickering yellow glow of a gas lamp reflecting off a rain-slick street in a town where the factories never seemed to sleep, but the people were beginning to find a way to reclaim their own time. This was the era of a strange and unofficial holiday known as St. Monday, where the workers of American Britain decided that the transition from a day of rest to a day of grueling labor was simply too sharp a turn to take. You can see the weary shoemakers and the tired weavers sitting around a low wooden table on a Sunday evening, where the laughter is slow, and the stories are long as they pass around mugs of dark ale to wash away the dust of a 60-hour week. As the night deepens and the fire on the hearth burns down to glowing embers, a silent agreement is reached among the men and women that the coming morning will not be greeted by the sound of factory whistle, but by the quiet comfort of their own beds. When the sun finally crests the horizon on Monday morning, the great chimneys of the mills begin to belch black smoke into the pale blue sky, but the streets remain unusually still, as if the world has hit a pause button in the middle of a frantic symphony. This was not a loud protest with banners or shouting, but a soft and sluggish defiance where the body simply refused to move at the command of the clock. The workers called it St. Monday as if the day itself were a holy figure deserving of devotion and rest, and they spent these stolen hours in a state of hazy recovery, wandering through the local markets or sitting in the tall grass of the commons far away from the rhythmic clatter of the looms. You can feel the slow pulse of this stolen time as if the entire town is taking a collective breath while the machines wait in vain for the hands that guide them. The factory owners would pace their counting houses with heavy pocket watches in hand, wondering why the floor was half empty. But the tradition of St. Monday was so deeply rooted in the culture of the craftspeople that it became a localized law of its own. It was a time of recovery from the indulgences of Sunday, a day where the headache of the previous night was treated with the medicine of silence and the luxury of a slow walk in the afternoon sun. Imagine the sound of a distant bell ringing across a quiet valley, where the only task is to watch the shadows of the clouds drift across the brickwork of the silent workshops. This was the first true crack in the foundation of the 6-day work week, a realization that the human spirit required more than just a single day of prayer to replenish its reserves of energy and joy. As you listen to the steady flow of these words, imagine yourself sinking into a deep armchair in a room where the only light comes from a dying fire, and the only schedule is the slow ticking of a grandfather clock that doesn't care about production quotas or deadlines. The workers of the 1800s knew the value of this stillness, and they guarded their Mondays with a quiet ferocity, choosing the poverty of a missed day's wage over the exhaustion of the soul. Without rest, the air is still and the world is soft. And the repetition of the days becomes a soothing loop that lulls you into a state of perfect relaxation, where the concept of work is a fading memory, and the concept of St. Monday is a warm blanket wrapped around your senses. Every breath you take is a tribute to that ancient leisure where the mind is allowed to wander through forests of thought without a destination or a map. The taverns are quiet now and the streets are empty, and the rebellion of rest has won the night as the stars begin to peer through the haze of the industrial age. Feel the heaviness in your eyes as if you too have spent the day avoiding the call of the factory and are now ready to surrender to the ultimate peace of night that has no morning alarm. The history of the weekend is a history of people reclaiming their lives one Monday at a time, and as you drift further into the shadows of sleep, you are joining a long line of dreamers who knew that rest is the most radical act of all. The world is hushed and the gears are locked, and the only thing that matters is the rhythmic rise and fall of your chest as you sink deeper and deeper into the velvet darkness, where every comma is a step toward dream and every period is a gate closing on the noise of the outside world. Sleep is coming for you like a slow-moving river, and you are floating on its surface toward a place where time has no meaning and the work is finally done. Let the story of St. Monday be the last thing you think of as the light fades out and the quiet takes over your room and your mind and your heart until there is nothing left but the beautiful, boring bliss of sleep. In the late 19th century, the air in the bustling streets of New York and the industrial centers of the Northeast was thick with the scent of salt water and cedar and the sound of 1,000 different languages mingling in the heavy, humid air of the garment district, where the windows of a tenement stood open to catch a ghost of a breeze. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow lane where the shadows are long and the brick walls are cooling after a day of intense summer heat, and you notice a unique rhythm to the neighborhood where two different worlds are trying to find a balance between their faith and their survival. Among the immigrant families, there was a quiet but persistent tension that began to reshape the very calendar of the American life, because the Jewish workers who had traveled across the vast ocean brought with them the ancient tradition of the Sabbath, which began at sundown on Friday and lasted until the first stars appeared on Saturday night for these tailors. And seamstresses' Saturday was a day of sacred stillness and prayer, where no needle could move and no fire could be lit. But the factory whistles of the New World did not recognize the ancient laws of the Old World, and they demanded that the machines hum 6 days a week without exception. You can feel the heavy weight of the choice these workers faced as they stood in the dim light of the workshop, knowing that to honor their Saturday rest meant risking their meager wages or losing their jobs entirely. While their Christian neighbors observed Sunday as their day of quiet reflection and church bells, this created a strange and stuttering week where the rhythm production was constantly interrupted by the deep convictions of the people who powered the looms and the sewing machines, and the air was filled with a soft, persistent friction between the Saturday observers and the Sunday worshipers. Imagine the stillness of Saturday morning in a Jewish enclave where the shops are shuttered and the streets are quiet, while just a few blocks away the rest of the city is a roar of commerce and clatter. And then imagine a shift on Sunday when the Christian bells begin to ring, and the first group returns to work while the second group heads to the chapel. It was a fragmented existence where the community was never truly at rest together, and the fatigue began to settle into bones of every worker like a layer of fine gray dust that no amount of sleep could wash away as the years drifted by. Like slow-moving clouds over the Atlantic, a new idea began to take root in the minds of the labor leaders and the factory owners who realized that a city divided by its days of rest was a city that never truly found its stride. They began to whisper about a radical possibility of compromise that would allow both the Saturday Sabbath and the Sunday Lord's Day to coexist within a single span of time, which would eventually become the 2-day break we now know so well. You can feel the slow turning of the gears of history as the concept of a 5-day work week started as a solution to this religious puzzle, a way to grant everyone the dignity of their faith without the constant fear of the foreman's watch. Think of the quiet peace that would descend over a factory when it was finally decided to turn off the steam and lock the heavy oak doors for 48 hours straight, allowing the dust to settle on the fabric and the oil to pool beneath the silent gears, while the workers finally had a chance to breathe. The tension of the past began to dissolve into a shared anticipation of a long weekend with a Saturday light, and the Sunday bells no longer signaled a conflict, but a collective sigh of relief that echoed through the narrow alleys and the wide avenues alike. As you listen to this story, let your mind drift into that period of transition where the world was learning how to stop and how to value the space between the chores. The repetition of the weeks becomes a soothing hum, like the sound of a distant hive, and you are safe within the stillness of your own room, far away from the pressures of the 19th century mills. Feel the coolness of the sheets and the darkness of the night wrapping around you as we honor the ancestors who stood their ground for a day of rest and accidentally gave us the gift of the American weekend. The world is hushed now and the debate is over, and the 2 days of peace have stretched out into an eternity of calm where you have nothing to do but close your eyes and follow the rhythmic path of your own breath. The sewing machines are silent, and the bobbins are full, and the fabric of the day is folded neatly away for the morning that is still many hours away. Let the story of the Sabbath and the Sunday bells pull you deeper into the velvet folds of a dreamless sleep, where time is a river that flows without effort, and the shore is always within reach. The stars are watching over the city, and the tension has faded into the soft gray mist of history, leaving only the quiet beauty of a world at rest. Sleep now, and let the silence be your companion, as you drift further and further away from the light into the deep and steady peace of night. In the late 19th century, the industrial heart of America was a place of iron and shadow, where the air was thick with a heavy scent of hot oil and the metallic tang of iron filings that seemed to hang in the stagnant air of the great brick cathedrals of industry. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of a massive textile mill or a sprawling steel foundry, where the windows are coated in a layer of soot so thick that the sunlight only enters as a dull and ghostly amber glow inside. The walls of noise is a physical force, a relentless rhythmic thumping and grinding that vibrates through the wooden floorboards and settles deep within your chest like a second heartbeat that you cannot quiet. The workers of this era were tethered to machines that never tired and never slept, and for 12 or 14 hours every single day, they move in a repetitive trance, matching their human movements to the unyielding pace of the spinning bobbins and the heavy steam hammers. You can feel the oppressive heat of the boiler rooms where the firemen shovel coal into the white-hot maws of the furnaces, their skin glistening with sweat, and their lungs breathing in the fine black dust that floats in the air like a dark winter snow. There is no cooling breeze and no moment of silence, only the constant whirring of leather belts overhead and the clatter of metal upon metal that fills every corner of the vast cavernous space. The conditions were a test of the human spirit, where the fingers of small children and the tired hands of elders worked side by side in the dim light of flickering gas lamps that cast long dancing shadows against the brick walls. It was in this environment of unending toil that a quiet but powerful cry began to rise from the depths of the coal mines and the floors of the garment shops, a simple and rhythmic demand for 8 hours of work, and 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours for what we will. Imagine this phrase as a slow and steady chant that begins to drown out the noise of machinery, a mantra for a life that was more than just a cycle of exhaustion and sleep. The movement for the 8-hour day was born from the deep and aching tiredness of millions who saw the sun rise through a factory window and watched it set from the same spot day after day until the seasons blurred into one long gray stretch of labor. The labor unions began to form in the quiet corners of boarding houses and in the back rooms of darkened taverns where men and women whisper about a future where the night belonged to them and the day was not a prison sentence. You can feel the heaviness of their fatigue as they march through the streets of Chicago and New York, their boots striking the cobblestones with a dull and tired thud as they held banners that asked for nothing more than the time to breathe and the time to dream. The struggle was long and the path was weary, but the vision of a balanced life was like a distant lighthouse guiding them through the fog of the industrial age. As you listen to the story of their struggle, let your own muscles relax and release the tension of the modern world, knowing that the battle they fought has given you the right to this very moment of stillness. The factories of the past are now silent ruins overgrown with ivy, and the roar of the steam engines has faded into the whispers of history, leaving behind only the quiet peace of the evening. The air in your room is cool and clear, far away from the soot and the heat of the 1880s, and the only rhythm you need to follow is the slow and natural pace of your own breathing. Imagine the heavy iron doors of those old mills being locked for night, and the fires and furnaces being dimmed until there are nothing but glowing embers in the dark. The world is hushed and the struggle for time has been won, and the 8 hours of rest that they cried for are now yours to claim in the velvet darkness of the night. Every comma is a gentle wave lapping against the shore, and every period is a soft pillow for your thoughts as you drift further away from the noise of production and into the vast open space of a dreamless slumber. The unions have laid down their banners, and the bosses have closed their ledgers, and the only task remaining is to let go of the day and surrender to the gravity of sleep. You are safe, and you are tired, and the history of the workday is just a fading echo in the back of your mind as the stars take their places in the silent sky. Sleep now as the heavy weight of the 19th century dissolves into the mist, and the peace of the present moment wraps around you like a cocoon of softest wool. The journey is over, and the rest is here, and the world is quiet at last. In the late spring of 1886, the city of Chicago was a place of heavy iron and thick gray smoke, where the air hung still and humid over the crowded tenements and the vast sprawling rail yards that stretched like iron veins across the prairie landscape. Imagine the low and constant hum of the city as tens of thousands of workers began to lay down their tools and walk out of the silent factories into the bright and dusty streets fueled by a single shared vision of an 8-hour day that would allow them to finally see the sunlight outside of a workshop window. The atmosphere was charged with quiet intensity as the movement for a shorter work week transitioned from a whispered dream in the dark corners of social halls to a massive and visible tide of humanity flowing through the streets of the Haymarket district. You could see the heavy cobblestones beneath the feet of the marchers and the flickering shadows cast by the gas lamps as evening began to fall over the city on that fateful 4th of May, while a light rain started to drizzle from a leaden sky, cooling the heated brows of the weary men and women who had gathered to listen to the passionate speeches of their leaders. The tragedy that unfolded in the darkness of Haymarket Square was a moment of sudden and jarring chaos that shattered the silence of the night and left a permanent scar on the heart of the labor movement. Yet, as the echoes of the conflict faded into the damp night air, something profound began to shift in the collective consciousness of the American people. Even as the headlines of the newspapers screamed with tales of unrest, the quiet reality of the workers' struggle began to seep into homes of the middle class and the offices of the policymakers like a slow-moving fog that cannot be turned back by force. The tragedy became a catalyst for a national conversation about the basic human right to rest and the idea that a person is more than just a mechanical component in a grand industrial machine began to take root in the fertile soil of the changing country. As you listen to the steady and repetitive cadence of this history, let your mind drift away from the noise of the conflict and toward the long and slow transformation that followed, where the sacrifice of those in Chicago became the foundation for the quiet weekends you enjoy today. The world is much calmer now in the Haymarket Square of the past is a place of memory and stillness, where the only sound is the wind whistling through the cracks in the old brick buildings and the soft rustled leaves in the nearby parks. The struggle for the 8-hour day was a long and winding road, but it led to the peaceful silence of the modern night, where the work is put away and the tools are hung up, and the only duty you have is to close your eyes and breathe in the cool night air. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress, as if you are moving through the slow passage of time from the turbulent 1880s into a future of guaranteed rest and protected leisure. The banners have all been folded and the speeches have all been spoken, and the city of Chicago is now asleep under a blanket of stars that do not change regardless of the century or the laws of men. Every comma in this story is a step further into the deep and velvet darkness of a dreamless sleep, where the history of labor is just a distant murmur, like the sound of a far-off train crossing the plains in the middle of the night. The movement for the shortened work week was won not just in the streets, but in the quiet moments of reflection that followed, when the nation realized that a tired worker is a soul that needs the sanctuary of the home and the healing power of the darkness. Let the heaviness of the past act as a weight that pulls you down into the softest depths of your bed, where no whistles will blow and no clocks will demand your attention until the sun is high in the sky. You are safe in the present moment, protected by the legacy of those who marched so that you could rest, and the silence of the room is a gift that stretches out for hours and hours. The gears of the great industrial age have ground to a halt, and the steam has dissipated into the atmosphere, leaving only the clarity of the night and the rhythmic pulse of your own steady heart. Sleep now as the story of Haymarket dissolves into a gentle haze, and the only reality is the comfort of your surroundings and the infinite peace of a mind that has let go of the day. The tragedy has passed and the movement has succeeded, and the world is finally quiet enough for you to find the rest you deserve in the deep and silent heart of the night. In the early 20th century, the air in Detroit was thick with the scent of motor oil and the steady mechanical rhythm of the assembly line, where the Highland Park plant stood as a towering monument to a new kind of world. And you can imagine yourself walking to the vast quiet halls of the factory floor, where the heavy machinery sits silent in the moonlight, reflecting the silver glow of the stars through the high glass windows. It was in the year 1926 that Henry Ford sat in his quiet office and looked out over the empire of steel he had built, realizing that the millions of cars rolling off his lines needed more than just roads to drive on. They needed people with the time to enjoy them and the money to fuel them. Ford was a man of cold logic and precise measurements, and he understood that a worker who is exhausted after a 6-day week has no desire to wander the countryside or explore the winding dirt roads of rural America. So he made a decision that would ripple through history like a stone dropped into a still, dark pond. He announced that the 48-hour week will become the 40-hour week, and that Saturdays would join Sundays as a permanent sanctuary of rest, not out of simple kindness, but because he knew that leisure was the secret fuel of the capitalist machine. Imagine the surprise and the sudden stillness that fell over the industrial landscape as the workers realized they had 2 full days to themselves, 2 days to wash the grease from their hands and put on their Sunday best, or take the family for a long, slow drive in a Model T through the tall grass of the Michigan fields. This was the birth of the consumer, as we know, at a time where the weekend became a marketplace of experiences, and the quiet Saturdays were filled with the sound of tires on gravel and the smell of roadside picnics, and the laughter of children who finally saw their fathers in the daylight of a weekend afternoon. As you listen to the steady pace of this story, feel the weight of the work week lifting from your shoulders, just as it did for those laborers a century ago when the clock finally struck 5 on a Friday evening, and the long expanse of the weekend stretched out like a calm and endless sea. The machines were hooded in canvas, and the steam was bled from the pipes, and a deep and heavy silence settled over the city of Detroit as 100,000 families prepared for a 48-hour dream of freedom and exploration. The idea was that if you give a man a car and the time to use it, he will buy tires and gasoline and snacks and clothing, and thus the wheels of industry would turn even faster while the people were at rest. You can feel the rhythmic pulse of this new American life where the week is a focused burst of energy and the weekend is a slow and luxurious drift through the quiet spaces of the soul. The landscape of America began to change with roadside diners and motels and gas stations appearing like small islands of comfort along the highways, all fueled by the fact that for 2 days a week the factory whistle was silent. Imagine the soft ticking of a car engine cooling down in a quiet driveway after a long Saturday excursion, and the way the shadows stretch across the lawn as the sun sets on a world that has finally learned how to pause. Every comma in this narrative is a gentle breath of that cool 1920s air, and every period is a deep plunge into the stillness of a night that is no work waiting. Ford in the morning. Ford's gamble was a success, and the 5-day week became the standard of the modern age, a legacy of rest that allows you to lie here now in the perfect darkness of your room, knowing that the world will wait for you to return. The assembly lines of the past are now echoes in a museum, and the frantic pace of the early factories has been replaced by the steady and comforting heartbeat of your own relaxation. As you drift further away from the logic of industry and into the hazy soft edges of a dream, think of the millions of people who have enjoyed this two-day reprieve because of the businessman's calculation and the long struggle of the unions that came before him. The stars over Michigan are the same stars over your roof tonight, and they shine with a cold and ancient light that cares nothing for productivity or quotas, only for the vast and beautiful silence of the night. Your body is heavy and your mind is clear, and the story of the weekend is a lullaby that guides you into the deepest folds of restorative sleep, where time is no longer a commodity to be sold, but a gift to be cherished. The engine has stopped and the lights are out, and the weekend of history has finally brought you to this moment of total and absolute peace. Sleep now as the world of Ford and the world of the assembly line fades into a distant blur, and the only thing left is the warmth of your blanket and the quiet sanctuary of your dreams. In the quiet hum of the early 20th century, there was a fundamental shift in the way the world understood the relationship between the clock and the dollar, and it all centered around the realization that a person who is always working is a person who never has the opportunity to participate in the world they are building. Imagine the mind of Henry Ford as a vast and silent warehouse of logic, where he began to see that the millions of Model T cars rolling off his assembly lines were not just machines, but symbols of a new kind of freedom that required the luxury of time to be truly valuable. He looked at the exhausted faces of his workers and saw not just labor, but untapped potential for consumption, because a man who spends 16 hours a day in a dark factory has no need for a stylish suit of clothes or a tank of gasoline or a vacation cottage by a quiet lake. Ford's philosophy was as simple and steady as the ticking of a grandfather clock in a silent hallway, and it rested on the idea that the weekend was not an act of charity, but a strategic engine for economic growth. He understood that by giving his employees Saturdays and Sundays off, he was essentially creating a market for his own products, because a family with 2 days of leisure would naturally want to explore the winding dirt roads of the American countryside and would need a reliable vehicle to take them there. You can imagine the ripple effect of this quiet revolution as it spread through the textile mills, where clothes were made for weekend outings, and the oil refineries where fuel was processed for Sunday drives, and the small roadside diners where families would stop for a slow meal under the shade of an oak tree. This was the birth of the modern middle-class lifestyle, a world where the week was a structured period of production, and the weekend was a sprawling landscape of possibility and rest. As you listen to the rhythmic flow of this history, let your own thoughts slow down to match the pace of the long drive through the rolling hills of the 1920s, where the only sound is the soft crunch of gravel beneath tires and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. The philosophy of the weekend was a realization that the economy is a living, breathing thing that needs cycles of rest just as much as a human body does, and that the time spent away from the machine is just as important as the time spent at it. Every comma in this narrative is a gentle reminder that the work is over and the leisure has begun, and every period is a deep breath of the cool night air that settles over the silent factories of Michigan. Ford proved to the world that a shorter work week led to a more vibrant society, where people had the energy to dream and the time to turn those dreams into reality by visiting new places and buying new things and enjoying the simple pleasure of quiet afternoon at home. Feel the weight of your limbs as you consider this shift in history, moving from the frantic pressure of constant toil to the calm and steady promise of a 40-hour week. The world began to open up like a flower in the morning sun, as people realized that they were more than just gears and clock, and that their value was not measured solely by their output, but by their capacity to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Imagine the vast American landscape stretching out before you, with its endless roads and silent forests, all waiting to be discovered during those 2 precious days of rest that were once considered a radical dream. The gears of the economy are still turning, but for you right now they are distant and soft like the sound of a far-off waterfall. And you are safe within the sanctuary of your own room, where time has no price, and the only requirement is to let go of the day. The philosophy of Ford is now a foundational part of our lives, a quiet background noise that ensures we have the space to breathe and the time to recover from the demands of the modern world. As you drift further into the shadows of sleep, think of the millions of people who have found comfort in this balance and let their collective peace wrap around you like a heavy velvet curtain. The shops are closed and the roads are empty, and the cars are parked in quiet garages while the stars continue their slow and silent march across the velvet sky. You have earned this stillness, and the economy of your own mind is now focused entirely on the beautiful and boring process of falling into a deep and restorative slumber where the hours stretch out before you like an endless weekend of the soul. Sleep now as the logic of the factory fades, and the intuition of the dream takes over, and the world becomes a place of soft edges and hushed whispers. There is nothing left to buy and nothing left to build, and nothing left to do but surrender to the steady pull of gravity and the infinite calm of the night. In the quiet shadows of the 1930s, the air across the vast American landscape felt heavy and still, as if the country itself were holding its breath while the great wheels of industry slowed to a rhythmic crawl. Imagine yourself standing on a quiet street in a dusty Midwestern town, where the only sound is the soft rustle of dry leaves skipping across the pavement, and the distant lonesome whistle of a steam train carrying nothing but the cool autumn air. The vibrant energy of the roaring 20s had faded into a soft and somber gray, and the bustling factories that once roared day and night now stood like silent giants watching over the millions of people who waited for a sign of hope. During this time of the Great Depression, the economy was like a tired clock that needed winding, and the government in Washington began to realize that if there were only a few jobs left to go around, it made sense to spread those precious hours among as many people as possible. This was the birth of the work-sharing movement, a quiet and logical solution to a mountain of hardship, where the idea was to shorten the individual work week so that more hands could find their way back to the lathes and the desks and the assembly lines. You can feel the slow and steady shift in the national spirit as the concept of the 40-hour week transitioned from a radical dream to a necessary reality, a way to ensure that the burden of the collapse was shared and that the dignity of labor was preserved for the many instead of few. Imagine the soft flickering light of a radio in a darkened living room as families listen to the calm and measured voice of the president explaining that by working less we could all live a little better, and that the extra time given back to the people was not a waste, but a sanctuary for the soul. The government began to draft new rules and codes that capped the hours a person could toil in a single week, creating a natural space for the weekend to expand and solidify like cooling wax on a letter of historical importance. The air in the empty offices was cool and smelled of old paper and ink as the bureaucratic pens moved slowly across the ledgers of time, carving out a new definition of the American work life, where the sun would no longer set on a weary worker who had no hope of rest. This era of shared sacrifice led to a new kind of quiet where the Saturdays became even more silent and the Sundays became even more sacred because they represented a victory over the chaos of collapse. As you listen to the steady and repetitive flow of these words, let your own muscles soften into the mattress as if you are sinking into the deep and restorative stillness of a 1930s afternoon when the world had slowed down enough for everyone to notice the patterns of the clouds and the way the light filters through. The trees, the struggle of depression was a long and winding road, but it paved the way for the Fair Labor Standards Act and the permanent protection of your time, allowing the night to belong entirely to you without the fear of the morning bell. Every comma in this narrative is a gentle pulse of that historical quiet, and every period is a deep and heavy anchor pulling you down into the velvet darkness of a dreamless sleep, where the economy of the world is a distant and forgotten hum. The factories of the past are now just monuments to a time when we learn that less is often more, and that the health of the nation depends on the rest of its people. Feel the coolness of the sheets and the silence of the room, as if you are a passenger on a slow-moving boat drifting down a calm river in the heart of the country, far away from the noise of the city and the pressures of the modern age. The work has been shared and the jobs have been protected, and the long weekend of history has finally arrived to give you the peace that you have earned through the simple act of existing. The stars are watching over the silent plains and the empty warehouses and the quiet homes of the millions who found rest in the shadow of the great collapse. Your breathing is slow and your heart is steady, and the story of the shortened week is a soft blanket wrapped around your mind, shielding you from the brightness of the day. Sleep now as the 1930s fade into a hazy memory, and the only reality is the comfort of your bed and the infinite calm of a night that has no end in sight. The government of your dreams has declared a permanent holiday, and there is nothing left to do but surrender to the beautiful and boring bliss of total relaxation. Sleep is the final destination, and you have reached it at last in quiet and steady pulse of the dark. In the humid warmth of a Washington summer in 1938, the air inside the Oval Office was still and heavy with the scent of old leather and furniture polish, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat at his massive oak desk with a heavy fountain pen in his hand and a stack of papers that would forever change the rhythm of the American pulse. Imagine the soft scratching sound of the nib moving across the parchment as he signed the Fair Labor Standards Act into law, a moment of quiet significance that acted like a giant mechanical brake on the runaway engine of the industrial age. For over a century, the people had fought and marched and whispered in the dark for a life that was not entirely consumed by the machine, and now, with a few strokes, the 40-hour work week became a law of the land, and the modern weekend was finally transformed from a fragile dream into a legal right for millions of weary souls. You can feel the wave of relief washing over the country like a cool breeze moving across the Great Plains at twilight as the news traveled from the marble halls of government to the dusty shop floors of the Midwest and the crowded shipyards of the West Coast, where workers finally realized that the Friday evening sun would now signal a true period of sanctuary. This landmark moment was a culmination of generations of struggle, and it brought a new kind of silence to the American landscape, a silence that was not born of unemployment or despair, but of protected and earned rest that allowed the body to heal and the mind to wander through the quiet spaces of a Saturday morning. Imagine the heavy iron gates of factories across the nation being closed with a final and satisfying thud as the steam was let out of the boilers and the gears were locked in place for 2 full days of peace, while the workers walked home with lighter steps, knowing that the law stood behind their right to be still. The law was a promise that the human spirit was not a commodity to be used until it broke, and that the weekend was a necessary refuge for the family and the community, and the simple act of being alive without a task complete. As you listen to the steady and repetitive flow of this history, let your own breathing match the slow and deliberate pace of FDR's pen as it moved across the page, creating a legacy of leisure that protects your sleep even now in the modern world. The atmosphere of 1938 was one of gradual transformation, where the frantic pace of the past began to dissolve into a more human rhythm, and the concept of time off became a foundational pillar of the American dream. You can see the sun setting over the Potomac River and the shadows lengthening in the quiet corridors of power, where the struggle for the 8-hour day had finally reached its destination in the legal code of a growing nation. Every comma in this long narrative is a moment of pause in that historical journey, and every period is a deep and steady breath of the cool night air that follows a long day of work well done. The weekend was no longer a gift from a boss or a lucky break for a few, but a guaranteed portion of the week, where the only duty was to rest and recover and enjoy the simple pleasures of a world at peace. Feel the heaviness of your own limbs sinking into the comfort of your bed, as if you are being pulled down by the gravity of 100 years of history, all leading to this single moment of total and absolute relaxation. The law has been signed, and the books are closed, and the rights of the sleeper are now fully protected under the quiet canopy of the night stars. The factories are dark, and the offices are empty, and the long struggle for the 40-hour week has faded into the soft gray mist of memory, leaving behind only the gift of time. Imagine the quiet of a 1930s neighborhood on a Saturday night, where the only sound is the soft murmur of a radio or the wind in the elm trees, and realize that this same peace is yours to claim right now in the stillness of your own room. The pen has been put away and the president has retired for the evening, and the world is finally quiet enough for you to let go of everything and surrender to the beautiful and boring bliss of a dreamless slumber. The weekend has arrived in your mind, and it stretches out forever like a calm ocean under a pale moon where there are no waves and no currents and no tides. To pull you back to the shore of the day, Sleep now as the Fair Labor Standards Act wraps around you like a heavy protective blanket, and the history of the work week becomes a soothing lullaby that guides you deeper and deeper into the heart of the night. You are safe and you are free, and the rest you are taking is supported by the law of the land and the law of your own weary heart. The stars are steady, and the air is cool, and the long weekend of the soul has finally begun. Sleep is the only task remaining, and you are performing it perfectly as you drift away into the velvet darkness where time has no meaning and the world is at rest at last. In the soft golden haze of the 1950s, the American landscape began to stretch and bloom into a new kind of quiet perfection, where the air smelled of freshly cut grass and the sweet charcoal smoke of backyard grills drifting over white picket fences. Imagine yourself standing on a pristine sidewalk in a burgeoning suburban neighborhood, just as the sun begins its slow descent on a Friday afternoon, casting long honey-colored shadows across perfectly manicured lawns that look like velvet, under the cooling sky. This was the era of the suburban dream of time, when the hard-won 40-hour week finally bore fruit in the form of a 2-day sanctuary dedicated entirely to the family and the slow pace of domestic life, where the frantic clatter of the industrial past was replaced by the gentle whir of a lawnmower or the soft thud of a newspaper hitting a front porch. As the cars of their chrome grills and sweeping tail fins pulled into gravel driveways, the weekend officially began, not with a roar, but with a collective sigh of relief that echoed from the coast of California to the suburbs of Long Island. You can feel the rhythmic pulse of this peaceful decade, where Saturdays were reserved for the ritual of the road trip, a slow and steady journey down two-lane highways lined with oak trees and small diners, where the only goal was to see the horizon and breathe in the open air of a country at rest. Imagine the interior of a station wagon with its wide bench seats and the soft static of a distant radio station playing a melodic tune that matches the heartbeat of the rolling road as you drift past fields of corn and sleepy barns that haven't changed in 100 years. The backyard became the new center of the universe, a private patch of green where the primary task was the art of the barbecue, a slow and methodical process of tending to the coals and watching the thin blue smoke curl up toward the first stars of the evening. Neighbors would lean over fences too, exchange quiet words about the weather or the garden, and the sense of community was as thick and comforting as a heavy wool blanket on a chilly night. There was no urgency in the 1950s weekend, only the steady flow of time moving like a calm river through a flat valley, where every hour was a gift to be spent on the porch or in the garage or at the kitchen table over a long and lingering breakfast. You can feel the weight of your own limbs becoming heavy and still as you sink into the memory of the suburban stillness, where the world felt safe and the boundaries of the weekend were respected like a sacred law. The houses with their pastel colors and glowing windows stood as quiet fortresses of comfort, and the only schedule to follow was a natural transition from the bright activity of the morning to the hushed murmurs of the evening. The concept of family time became the foundation of the American spirit, a shared experience of simple pleasures like catching fireflies in a glass jar or watching the flicker of black and white television in a darkened living room while the crickets outside sang a repetitive lullaby that never seemed to end. Every comma in this narrative is a gentle wave of nostalgia, pulling you deeper into a state of total relaxation, and every period is a soft gate closing behind you to keep the noise of the modern world far away from your sanctuary. The roads of the 1950s were open and empty, and the pace of life was dictated by the speed of a bicycle or the walk to the corner store, where the world felt small and manageable and infinitely peaceful. Imagine the smell of rain on a warm asphalt driveway in mid-July, and the way the air cools down after a late afternoon thunderstorm, leaving everything sparkling and silent in the twilight. The suburban dream was a promise of a life well lived in the spaces between the work, and as you listen to the steady cadence of this story, you are inhabiting that space where there are no deadlines and no demands, only the infinite calm of Saturday night that stretches on forever. The station wagons are all parked and the grills have gone cold, and the families are tucked away in their cozy bedrooms under the watchful eyes of the moon and the stars that shine with steady and unchanging light. Your heart is beating in time with the quietest moments of history, and your mind is a blank canvas ready to be painted with the softest colors of sleep. The 50s were a decade of breathing room, a time when we learned how to be still and how to value the silence of a Sunday morning before the church bells began to ring. And as you drift further into the velvet darkness, you are carrying that stillness with you into your own dreams. The picket fences are shadows now, and the lawns are dark, and the only movement is a slow and rhythmic rise and fall of your chest as you surrender to the beautiful and boring bliss of a world that has finally stopped turning for the night. Sleep is the ultimate destination of a suburban road trip, and you have arrived at the front door where the porch light is dim and the bed is warm and the rest is absolute. The history of the weekend has brought you to this golden age of quiet, and you are free to stay here as long as you like in the deep and restorative heart of the night. Sleep now as the 50s fade into a hazy dream of chrome and green, and the only reality is the perfect peace of the present moment. In the deep and quiet layers of the American past, there existed a time when the world was painted in the softest shades of stillness every seventh day, as if the entire continent had collectively agreed to hold its breath and listen to the wind in the trees. Imagine a Sunday morning in a small town during the middle of the 20th century, where the air is exceptionally clear and the usual clatter of the mechanical world has been replaced by a silence so thick and heavy it feels like a physical presence wrapping around the brick buildings and the wooden porches. This was the era of the blue laws, those ancient and invisible threads of tradition and legislation that trace their roots back to the very foundation of the colonies and ensure that the day of rest remained a sanctuary far removed from the frantic pulse of commerce and trade. You can see the main street of a typical American town where every shop door is locked tight, and the large glass windows of the department stores are dark and reflective like the surface of a still pond in the moonlight. There are no neon signs flickering with the promise of sale, and no rhythmic sound of cash registers ringing, because the law of the land dictated that the pursuit of profit must pause to allow for pursuit of peace. The streets are empty of the usual traffic, and the only movement is the slow drift of a fallen leaf across the cobblestones, or the steady swaying of the tall elms that line the residential avenues where families are gathered in a state of quiet repose. You can feel the rhythmic weight of this mandatory rest, as if the heavy hand of history has gently pushed the world into a reclining position where the only duty is to be present and still in the cool shadows of a parlor or the soft light of a backyard garden, before the arrival of the 24/7 commercial culture that would eventually blur the lines between day and night and work, and play the Sunday was a day of profound and predictable emptiness that allowed the mind to reset its internal clock to the pace of nature. Imagine the sound of the church bells ringing across the valley, their deep and resonant tones vibrating through the morning mist and signaling a time of reflection that transcended the simple counting of hours and minutes. The blue laws were a barrier against the encroachment of the noisy world, ensuring that even the most ambitious merchant and the most tireless worker had to surrender to the gravity of the Sabbath. You can smell the faint scent of old hymnals and floor wax in the quiet chapels, and the aroma of a slow roasting Sunday dinner that fills the hallways of the neighborhood houses, where the only schedule is a traditional family gathering around a heavy oak table. There is a hypnotic quality to this historical quiet, as if the entire country is a giant grandfather clock that has been wound just enough to keep the heartbeat steady, without the need for a frantic second hand. The stores remained shuttered until the sun had set, and the evening shadows had claimed the town, creating a vast and open space in the middle of the week where the soul could wander without being asked to buy or sell or produce. As you listen to the steady and repetitive flow of these words, imagine yourself sinking deeper into the soft cushions of a chair in that era where the television was off and the telephone was silent, and the only entertainment was a slow progression of the sun across the wallpaper. Every comma in this long narrative is a gentle pulse of that sacred Sunday quiet, and every period is a deep breath of the cool, unhurried air that once defined the American weekend before the lights of the shopping malls and the digital screens began to glow without end. The blue laws were a legacy of a time when the rhythm of the heart was considered more important than the rhythm of the stock market. And as you drift further into the velvet darkness of your room, you are reclaiming that ancient right to be absolutely and beautifully still. The world outside is hushed, and the commercial noise of the modern age is a distant and fading memory, like the sound of far-off train disappearing into the mountains and leaving behind only the vast and empty silence of the wilderness. Feel the heaviness of your eyes and the warmth of your blanket as the story of the quiet Sundays acts as a lullaby for your weary thoughts, guiding you away from the demands of the present and into the restorative depths of a dreamless sleep. The shops of history are all closed now, and the lights are out, and the streets of the past are bathed in the silver glow of moon that knows nothing of commerce, only of the steady passage of time. You are safe in this sanctuary of stillness, protected by the memories of a world that once knew how to stop and how to value the silence of a day without a task. The history of the Blue Laws is a history of the boundary between the public and the private. And as you cross that boundary into the realm of sleep, you are leaving the world of work far behind you. The bells have stopped ringing, and the dinner is over, and the sun has dipped below the horizon, leaving a world that is perfectly prepared for the arrival of the night. Sleep now as the quiet Sundays of long ago wrap around you like a heavy protective cocoon, and the only reality is the rhythmic rise and fall of your chest and the infinite calm of mind that has finally found its rest. The 24/7 world has faded into a blur, and the only thing that remains is the beautiful and boring bliss of total and absolute relaxation in the heart of the night. In the soft flickering light of the 1970s and 80s, the American landscape began to shift away from the heavy rhythmic clatters of the iron mills and toward the muffled hum of the office park, where the air was conditioned and the sound of the world was a steady mechanical chirp of electric typewriters and the soft shuffle of paper on wooden desks. Imagine yourself sitting in a swivel chair as the late afternoon sun filters through the slats of a horizontal blind casting long. Stripes of amber light across a beige carpet that stretches out into a sea of quiet cubicles and empty corridors. This was the era of the white-collar transition, a time when the physical exhaustion of the factory floor was replaced by a different kind of mental tiredness, a slow and steady accumulation of meetings and memos, and the rhythmic flickering of the first green computer screens that seemed to pulse in time with the quiet heartbeat of the building. As the decade progressed, the concept of the weekend evolved from a period of physical recovery into a cultural phenomenon known as "Thank God It Is Friday," a phrase that began as a whispered sigh of relief in the elevator and blossomed into a national anthem of leisure that was celebrated in the neon glow of the Friday evening fern bars and the crowded aisles of the local movie theaters. You can feel the slow and steady transition as the clock on the wall ticks toward 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon in 1982, and the energy of the office begins to settle like dust in a shaft of light as people prepare to lock their desk drawers and leave behind the world of spreadsheets and telephones for the promised land of the 48-hour break. The TGIF mindset was a collective realization that the work week was a bridge to be crossed and that the destination was a sanctuary of blue jeans and backyard gatherings and the slow pace of the shopping mall, where the only deadline was the beginning of the evening news. Imagine the sound of 1,000 car doors closing in an office parking lot at dusk, a rhythmic thud that signals the official end of a professional day and the beginning of a long and luxurious drift through the quiet spaces of the American weekend. The music of the era was filled with the sounds of synthesizers and smooth melodies that acted as a soundtrack to this new kind of freedom where the office was a distant memory, and the only requirement was to be present in the moment and enjoy the simple luxury of not having to be anywhere at all. As you listen to the steady flow of these words, let your mind wander through the hallways of those silent offices where the water coolers are still and the fluorescent lights have been dimmed for the weekend, leaving behind a world of perfect and absolute stillness. The transition to office work meant that the weekend became a time of mental decompression, a slow unspooling of the thoughts and pressures that had gathered during the week, like a coiled spring finally being allowed to rest and expand in the cool night air. You can smell the faint scent of floor wax and coffee that lingers in the empty break rooms and feel the weight of your own limbs becoming heavy, as if you are leaving the office behind and sinking into the soft plush seats of a sedan, driving toward the quiet suburbs where the only lights are the glow of the street lamps and the flickering of the television in the living room. Every comma in this long narrative is a gentle breath of that 80s evening air, and every period is a deep and steady anchor, pulling you down into the velvet darkness of a dreamless sleep, where the white-collar world is just a fading echo of a distant time. The culture of TGIF was a celebration of the boundary between the public self and the private self, a reminder that the most important part of the week was the part that belonged entirely to you and your family and the silent stars above. Imagine the calm of a Saturday morning in 1985, where the only task is to read the thick morning newspaper or to watch the shadows of the birds as they fly across the backyard lawn, while the coffee pot hums a quiet tune in the kitchen. The offices of history are all locked now, and the phone lines are quiet, and the digital screens have faded to black, leaving you in a sanctuary of total relaxation, where there is no need to be productive and no need to be efficient. Your heart is beating in time with the slow and steady pulse of night, and your mind is a calm and empty office where all the files have been put away and all the lights have been turned off for the long holiday of the soul. Sleep is the final destination of the work week, and you have arrived at the gates where the air is cool and the silence is absolute, and the only schedule to follow is the natural rhythm of your own breath. The 70s and 80s were a bridge to the modern world, but right now they're just a soothing story that guides you into the deepest fold of the night, where the history of the weekend becomes a lullaby for the tired mind. Sleep now as the TGIF culture wraps around you like a heavy protective blanket, and the only reality is the comfort of your bed and the infinite peace of the night that has no morning meeting and no urgent task. The stars are watching over the empty office parks and the quiet suburban streets, and the world is finally still enough for you to find the rest you deserve. Sleep is coming for you like a slow-moving elevator descending into the quietest levels of the mind, and you are safe and sound in the heart of the night. In the quiet transition from the analog world to the digital age, there was a subtle and steady shift in the way the air felt on a Friday evening as the heavy brick walls of the office began to dissolve into the invisible signals of the atmosphere, and the clear boundaries of the weekend started to fray at the edges like an old map left out in the rain. Imagine yourself sitting in a room filled with the soft blue glow of a screen in the early years of the new millennium, where the silent arrival of the smartphone brought with it a tiny, persistent heartbeat of connectivity that whispered of emails and notifications even as the sun set behind the suburban trees. This was the beginning of the always-on culture time, when the pocket-sized machines became digital anchors tethering the mind to the workstation, even when the body was resting on a soft sofa or standing in the quiet aisle of the grocery store. You can feel the slow erosion of the sanctuary that FDR and the labor unions had built, with such heavy effort as the one solid wall between professional and the private became a porous curtain through which the light of the office could leak at any hour of the night. The remote work revolution brought with it the luxury of the home office, but also the weight of a desk that never truly closed and a laptop that sat in the corner of the bedroom like a silent observer, waiting for a single click to spring back into life. Imagine the rhythmic tapping of keys in the middle of a Saturday afternoon while the rest of the house is still, and the only sound is the hum of the refrigerator or the distant barking of a neighbor's dog as the digital world demands just one more minute of your attention. This era of constant access meant that the weekend was no longer a fortress of silence, but a landscape dotted with the small glowing fires of urgent tasks and the soft chirps of incoming messages that pull the mind away from the present moment and back into the frantic flow of production. You can feel the tiredness of a world that has forgotten how to truly unplug as the hard-won 40-hour week began to stretch into a seamless loop of availability, where the concept of thank God it is Friday lost its sharp relief against the background of a 24/7 schedule. But as you listen to the steady and repetitive cadence of this history, let yourself realize that even in a world of constant signals, you have the power to create a zone of absolute stillness where the digital noise cannot reach. Imagine the act of setting down the phone and watching the screen go dark, and feeling the heavy silence return to the room like a physical weight that anchors you to the here and now. The smartphones are quiet, and the laptops are closed, and the invisible signals are passing to the walls without touching your thoughts as you sink deeper into the soft support of your mattress. Every comma in this long narrative is a gentle disconnection from the network, and every period is a deep and steady breath of the analog night air that belongs only to you and the stars. The always-on culture is a distant hum like the sound of a city far below a mountain peak, and you are high above it in a place of total and absolute isolation where no notification can find you and no deadline can follow. The boundaries of the weekend are being rebuilt right now in the darkness of your room, as you reclaim the right to be unreachable and the right to be silent, and the right to simply exist without a digital footprint. Feel the coolness of the air and the weight of your eyelids as the history of the modern work week fades into a hazy blur of blue light that is finally being extinguished by the natural gravity of sleep. The servers are whirring in cold rooms far away, but your mind is a warm and quiet library where all the screens have been covered with velvet cloths, and the only task is to watch the slow and rhythmic rise and fall of your own chest. You are safe in the sanctuary of the offline world, protected by the darkness and the silence that have existed since the beginning of time, and no amount of technology can change the basic human need for the deep and restorative peace of the night. The digital invasion has retreated for the evening, leaving behind a world that is perfectly still and a mind that is finally ready to let go of the global conversation and join the ancient dialogue of the dream world. Sleep now as the smartphones fade and the remote offices close, and the only reality is the comfort of your bed and the infinite calm of a soul that has found its own off switch. The stars do not have data plans, and the moon does not send updates, and you are moving in harmony with their slow and silent orbit as you drift further and further into the velvet heart of a dreamless sleep. The work is done and the lines are clear, and the night is yours to keep in the beautiful and boring bliss of total relaxation. In the quiet, modern landscape of the 21st century, a new kind of contemplation has begun to settle over the busy cities and the sprawling suburbs where the air is filled with the invisible hum of the internet and the soft glow of glass towers that never truly go dark. Imagine yourself standing on a quiet balcony overlooking a modern American skyline as the sun dips below the horizon and the first few stars begin to blink through the haze of the atmosphere, and you realize that the world is beginning to question the 100-year-old architecture of the work week. The model that Henry Ford built with his iron logic and assembly lines was designed for a world of physical gears and heavy steam. But in the era of the mind and the digital cloud, the old boundaries of the 40-hour week has started to feel like a suit of clothes that no longer fits the body of the modern soul. You can feel the collective weight of a nation that is breathing through a burnout epidemic, where the constant connection to the office has turned the 2-day weekend into a frantic race to catch up on chores and sleep and grocery lists, leaving no room for the true stillness that the human spirit requires to remain vibrant. There's a growing movement of voices whispering in the quiet hours of the night asking if the 5-day week is still a relevant guide for a life that has become so complex and interconnected and always on. Imagine the slow and steady conversation shifting toward the idea of a 4-day work week as a new sanctuary of rest, where the 3-day weekend would allow for a deep and meaningful disconnection from the pressures of production and a return to the simple rhythms of the natural world. This modern perspective is not born of a desire to do less, but of a realization that the quality of our presence is more important than the quantity of our hours, and that a mind at rest is a mind that can see the beauty in the small details of a quiet afternoon as you listen to the repetitive and soothing cadence of this history. Let your own muscles soften into the support of your bed, as if you were letting go of the old Fordian clock and embracing a more fluid and gentle sense of time, where the day is not a series of slots to be filled, but a river to be followed. The debate over work-life balance is a slow and steady tide that is reshaping the shores of the American dream, and as you sink deeper into the velvet darkness, you are participating in that shift by choosing to prioritize your own recovery and your own peace above all else. The city lights below are shimmering like distant gems, but they feel far away and unimportant compared to the immediate warmth of your blanket and the rhythmic rise and fall of your chest in the silent room. The thinkers and the leaders are still debating the future of the work week in high offices and on digital platforms. But for you right now, the answer is simple and quiet as the night itself. Every comma in this narrative is a gentle release of a modern stress, and every period is a soft closure of a digital window, leaving you in a state of perfect and absolute analog calm. The 100-year-old model is fading into the mist of the past like a ship sailing away from the shore, and you are left on the beach in the present moment, where the only task is to watch the stars and listen to the internal melody of your own resting mind. The burnout is dissolving into the atmosphere, and the pressure to be productive is being replaced by the permission to be still, and the weekend of the future is a wide-open landscape of 3 days of sunlight and 4 nights of deep restorative sleep. Imagine a world where the Friday morning is as quiet as a Sunday used to be, and the air is clear, and the streets are empty of commuters, because the collective heart of the country has decided that rest is the ultimate form of wisdom. You are safe in this vision of the future, protected by the silence and the darkness that have always been the true home of the weary traveler. Feel the heaviness of your eyes as the modern world and its complicated perspectives fade into a blurry haze of soft edges and hushed whispers until there is nothing left but the beautiful and boring bliss of the night. The clock on the wall has lost its power over you, and the calendars of the world have been folded neatly and put away in a drawer, leaving you in a timeless space where the only requirement is to let go and drift the movement forward. Balance has won for tonight, and the victory is yours to enjoy in the deep and silent heart of your own dreams. Sleep now as the conversation ends and the quiet takes over, and the only reality is the comfort of your bed and the infinite peace of a soul that has found its own perfect rhythm in the dark. In the quiet, soft glow of the 21st century, the long story of the American work week is reaching a new and peaceful chapter where the air feels lighter and the frantic ticking of the old industrial clocks is finally being replaced by a rhythmic and gentle pulse that honors the human need for true stillness. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a new horizon where the morning sun rises over quiet office parks and silent workshops because a new experiment is unfolding across the vast landscape of the country, from the rocky coast of Maine to the sun-drenched hills of California, where pilot programs are testing the radical and beautiful idea of a 4-day work week. This is a time of quiet transition where the 5-day model of the past is slowly dissolving like sugar in warm tea, and the extra day of rest is appearing like a gift of time that was always meant to be yours. You can feel the heavy weight of the old system falling away as companies and cities begin to realize that the quality of a life is not measured by the number of hours spent under a fluorescent light, but by the depth of the peace found in the long shadows of a 3-day weekend. Imagine the silence of Friday morning where the highways are empty and the only sound is the wind rustling through the leaves of the neighborhood trees, because the world has decided that 4 days of focused labor are enough to sustain the engine of progress, and that the 3rd day of rest is a sacred space for the soul to wander and the body to heal. This is the closing of a long and weary circle that began in the soot and smoke of the 1800s. And as you listen to the steady and repetitive flow of these words, you can feel the history of the weekend coming to a soft and satisfying conclusion in the sanctuary of your own room. Every comma in this narrative is a gentle step toward that future of even greater rest, and every period is a deep and steady anchor pulling you into the velvet darkness of a night that is followed by a long and unhurried morning. The pilot programs are like small lanterns lighting the way to a world where the balance between work and life is no longer a struggle, but a natural harmony that matches the slow and steady orbit of the planets and the rhythmic rise and fall of the ocean tides. You are safe in this new era of leisure, protected by the collective wisdom of society that has finally learned how to stop and how to value the silence of a house at midday and the beauty of a walk in the woods without a phone in hand. The story of the work week has been told, and the final page is a vast and empty space of white light where nothing is written because there is nothing left to do but exist and breathe and be still. The 4-day week is not just a policy, but a promise of a deeper sleep and a longer dream and a more profound connection to the people and the places that matter most. Feel the coolness of your sheets and the warmth of your blanket as the modern world and its experiments fade into a hazy blur of soft edges and hushed whispers until there is nothing left but the beautiful and boring bliss of total and absolute relaxation. The engines of industry are cooling down and the digital signals are fading out, and the long weekend of human history has finally arrived to give you the peace that has been earned through centuries of toil. The stars over the American landscape are the same stars that watched the first mills and the first factories, but tonight they shine on a world that is much quieter and much kinder and much more rested. Your heart is beating in time with this new and gentle rhythm, and your mind is a calm and empty vessel ready to be filled with the softest colors of sleep, where time has no meaning and the work is forever done. Sleep now as the final chapter closes and the book is put away on a high shelf, and the only reality is the infinite calm of the night and the steady path of your own breath leading you into the deepest folds of a dreamless slumber. The weekend is here, and it is long, and it is yours, and the world is finally quiet enough for you to let go and disappear into the darkness where the story of rest never ends.